In the quiet neighborhood of Sherman Oaks, Los Angeles, Megan Fox's mansion stood as a stunning modern retreat. But beneath the sleek design and luxurious amenities, an unsettling story began to unfold shortly after she moved in. Megan first noticed something odd one evening when she returned home after a late-night shoot. The house was unusually quiet until the microwave suddenly started beeping, despite no one being near it. Thinking it was just a glitch, she dismissed it. However, similar incidents continued. Lights flickered unpredictably, the television would turn on at full volume in the dead of night, and the dishwasher once began running on its own. The peculiarities didn't stop there. Small items, like keys and jewelry, would disappear from their usual spots, only to reappear days later in places Megan swore she hadn't been. One particularly unnerving moment occurred when she heard faint footsteps echoing from the hallway while she was alone in the house. When she went to check, no one was there. Megan's friends dismissed the occurrences as coincidences or joked about her mansion being haunted. But she wasn't so sure. At one point, she even invited a spiritual medium to the house, hoping for some clarity. According to the medium, there was an unusual energy present in the home, though no clear explanation was given. Despite the eerie experiences, Megan has never publicly stated whether she believes her house is haunted. "It's definitely a place with personality," she once said in an interview with a nervous laugh. Whether it's supernatural or just a series of uncanny coincidences, her Sherman Oaks mansion remains the subject of speculation among fans and neighbors alike. After Megan Fox moved out of her Sherman Oaks mansion, the property quickly found new owners, a young, ambitious couple, Emily and Jason Grant. Drawn by the home's sleek modern architecture and prime location, they considered it their dream house. Little did they know, the mansion had a reputation that preceded them. Within the first week of settling in, Emily and Jason began to notice peculiarities. At first, it was minor. A faint hum emanating from the appliances even when unplugged, or their smart home system issuing strange, garbled commands. They chalked it up to technical issues. But as the days went on, the occurrences grew stranger. One night, while Jason was working late in the study, he heard a distinct tapping sound coming from the living room. Assuming Emily was up, he went to check, but the room was empty. The tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, seemingly coming from the walls. Emily experienced her own unsettling moments. While unpacking clothes in their walk-in closet, she felt a cold draft, though the air conditioning was off. Glancing into the mirror, she thought she saw a shadow move behind her. Turning around, she found nothing. Determined not to let their imaginations run wild, the couple brought in electricians, plumbers, and even a tech specialist to inspect the house. No faults were found. Everything is functioning perfectly, they were told. Yet, the strange occurrences continued. One particularly chilling night, Jason woke up to find their bedroom lights flickering erratically. As he reached for the switch, the lights went out completely. In the darkness, both Emily and Jason swore they heard faint whispers. The whispers didn't sound threatening, but their sheer presence was unnerving. Desperate for answers, the Grants began researching the home's history. To their surprise, they learned that the land on which the mansion was built had once been the site of a small, family-owned hotel in the early 1900s. The hotel had burned down in a mysterious fire, taking the lives of its owners and several guests. Believing the incidents might be tied to the property's history, Emily and Jason decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator. The investigator spent an entire night in the house, equipped with cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recorders. The results were chilling. Faint voices were captured on tape, and the equipment recorded unexplained temperature drops in several rooms. Despite these findings, Emily and Jason couldn't bring themselves to leave the house they had fallen in love with. Instead, they decided to coexist with the mansion's quirks. They placed crystals and protective symbols around the home and even held a small cleansing ceremony. To this day, the Grants remain in the mansion, where the strange occurrences continue, albeit less frequently. "It's part of the charm," Jason jokes, though his nervous laughter suggests he's not entirely at ease. For the neighbors and curious passers-by, the house remains a source of mystery, its beautiful facade hiding stories that may never be fully understood. As the months passed, the strange happenings in the mansion became less frequent but more intense. Emily and Jason, now somewhat accustomed to the oddities, started to feel as though they were being watched. It wasn't just the flickering lights or misplaced items anymore. It was a presence, a feeling that seemed to linger in the shadows of the house. One evening, Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a soft, distinct voice whisper her name. At first, she thought it was Jason calling from the other room, but when she went to check, he was still in his office, deeply absorbed in a project. Chilled, she returned to the kitchen, but now the air felt heavy unnaturally so. Later that week, the house experienced something that none of them could easily dismiss: the mirrors. It started with the small bathroom mirror in the guest bedroom. One morning, Jason walked in to find the reflection distorted, the glass fogged, despite the house being dry and warm. As he wiped it off, a message seemed to appear. "You're not alone." His heart raced, but when he looked closely, the condensation cleared, revealing nothing. That night, Emily and Jason decided to leave the mansion and stay at a nearby hotel to clear their minds. Upon their return, however, they found that something had changed. The house felt more alive. They didn't tell anyone, not even their closest friends, about what had been happening, but soon, even their visitors began noticing things. A friend of Emily's, visiting for the weekend, mentioned an uneasy feeling the moment she stepped inside. "It's like the walls are breathing," she said. Jason laughed it off, but in the pit of his stomach, something didn't sit right. When they all sat down for dinner that evening, the kitchen lights began to flicker rapidly, and the hum of the refrigerator grew louder. It was as though the house itself was reacting to their presence. But the most unsettling event occurred the night of the full moon. Jason woke up to find himself standing in the middle of the living room, barefoot and disoriented. His mind raced to piece together what had happened. He didn't remember getting out of bed. He didn't even remember leaving the bedroom. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator. But when he walked into the kitchen, the floor beneath him seemed to shift. The house groaned, as if it were stretching, waking from a deep slumber. He called Emily, but there was no answer. Panic set in as he searched the house. It was only when he went into the guest bedroom that he found her standing motionless in front of the mirror. Her eyes were wide open, but she didn't respond to him. It was as though she was in a trance. "Emily?" Jason's voice cracked as he shook her, but she didn't move. Her body felt cold like ice. Finally, with a shudder, Emily blinked and looked at him, but there was something different in her eyes. "It's time to leave," she whispered, her voice distant, almost foreign. The following day, they contacted the same paranormal investigator who had previously visited. This time, they were desperate for answers. The investigator arrived with a team, bringing more sophisticated equipment to track the supernatural activity. As they set up their devices, they discovered something none of them had anticipated. The house was surrounded by an intense electromagnetic field, far beyond normal levels. Later, as they reviewed the footage from the night, something terrifying was captured. It wasn't just the voices or the faint shadows in the corners of the room, there was something else. In the background of one of the recordings, a figure could be seen standing in the doorway of the living room. The figure was indistinct, flickering, as if not entirely present in this world. As they dug deeper, Emily and Jason learned about a hidden room in the mansion's foundation, one that was never included in any of the original blueprints. Local legends spoke of a forgotten space that had been sealed off during construction, a room with no windows, only a single, rusted door. Some believed it was meant to be a prison. Others claimed it had been used for ritualistic purposes. The more the couple learned, the more they began to suspect that this room might be the source of the house's strange energy. Against the investigators' warnings, Emily and Jason made the decision to find the hidden room. They brought in contractors to search the basement, and after days of digging, they uncovered the rusted door. With a mixture of curiosity and dread, they pried it open. But what they found inside would change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The door creaked open with a low, mournful sound, and as the dust settled, Emily and Jason stepped into the darkened room. The air was thick with a sense of oppression, as though the very walls were pressing in on them. They were immediately struck by the musty smell of decay, as if the room hadn't been disturbed for decades, maybe even longer. It was small, barely larger than a storage closet, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic symbols that appeared to be hand-drawn, fading with age but still visible in the dim light of their flashlights. In the center of the room stood an altar, an ancient stone slab covered with what looked like old, dried stains. At first, Emily thought it might just be the remnants of time, but then her eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. Scattered around the altar were shards of broken mirrors. Some were shattered into jagged pieces, while others had been deliberately arranged, forming an incomplete circle around the stone slab. Jason reached out and touched one of the mirrors. The moment his fingers brushed against the glass, a wave of nausea swept over him, and his vision blurred. He stumbled back, shaken, but the odd sensation lingered. Emily's voice trembled as she whispered, "We need to get out of here." But as she turned to leave, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the door slammed shut with an echo that reverberated through the house. The temperature dropped rapidly, their breath visible in the freezing air. In a panic, Emily tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She turned to Jason, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong. Something doesn't want us to leave." Jason's heart raced. He began to shout, banging on the door, but it was useless. The room seemed to close in on them, its oppressive energy intensifying. The symbols on the walls flickered in the dim light as if they were alive, pulsating with an eerie rhythm. And then the whispers returned. Soft at first, like distant voices, but they grew louder and more distinct, filling the air with a sense of urgency. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, swirling through the room like a storm. Jason could barely make out the words, fragments of sentences that were not in any language he recognized. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the house. The sound of something heavy being thrown against the walls, followed by the unmistakable noise of glass shattering. Emily and Jason exchanged terrified glances. "That wasn't just a sound. Something's moving in the house," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew they weren't alone. The air seemed to vibrate, thick with an unseen presence, and the symbols on the walls now appeared to be shifting, rearranging themselves before their eyes, as though the room itself was alive, responding to their fear. "Make it stop," Emily screamed, clutching Jason's arm. "We have to get out." But before they could react, the stone altar began to tremble. The ground beneath them rumbled as if something beneath the house had just awakened. The altar cracked, and from the gap emerged a faint, greenish light glowing from the cracks in the stone, as though it were emanating from some otherworldly source. Jason stepped back in horror, but Emily couldn't tear her eyes away. The light pulsed in a slow rhythm, like the beating of a heart. A voice low and guttural echoed through the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You should not have come." Frozen in terror, they both stood paralyzed. The room seemed to spin, the walls pressing in, and the air thickened with the weight of centuries of forgotten history. They could feel it, whatever it was, sensing their presence, studying them, waiting. Suddenly, the light intensified, blinding them. For a split second, there was a violent jolt, a crashing sound of glass breaking, and then silence. The door flew open with a violent snap, and the room was still. They rushed outside, gasping for breath, as if they had been holding it for an eternity. But when they emerged, they found something horrifying. The house had changed. The familiar hallways they once knew now twisted and turned in disorienting patterns, as though the mansion had rearranged itself while they were trapped in that room. The air was thick with the same strange energy that had filled the hidden space, and there was a subtle hum in the walls, like the house itself was alive. In the distance, they could hear something else. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hallway. They weren't alone anymore. Emily and Jason stood in the hallway, heartbeats racing, frozen with fear as the footsteps grew louder. The sound was methodical, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was walking toward them deliberately. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking. Jason nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We need to leave now." But as they moved to the front door, they noticed something that stopped them dead in their tracks. The once clear path to the exit was now obstructed. Where there had been a straight hallway, there were now walls suddenly erected, blocking their way. The mansion had indeed rearranged itself. There was no way out. The footsteps were closer now. A shadow passed by, creeping along the edges of their vision. Jason's instincts screamed to run, but every instinct in him told him it was already too late. They were trapped, and whatever was coming for them was already here. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice cracking. For a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, the shadows coalesced into a figure. It wasn't human. The shape was dark, shifting, like an impression of a person, but with hollow eyes and a face that couldn't be fully seen. It was as if the figure existed between worlds, an entity from beyond. "You should not have disturbed it," the figure whispered, its voice barely a breath, but cutting through them like a blade. "Disturbed what?" Jason managed to say, his throat dry, panic rising like a wave. "What is this? What's happening to the house?" The figure's eyes, glowing faintly, seemed to pierce into them. "The house is not a house. It is a prison, a place of binding. And you opened it." The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, pressing in from all sides, enveloping them like a heavy blanket. Jason and Emily stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in sync with the figure before them. "You were meant to find the room," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more menacing. "It was always meant to be found. And now you will pay the price for awakening it." Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Jason's breath clouded in front of him, his teeth chattering. The figure began to move closer, its form becoming more solid, more defined. Its hands stretched out toward them, long, pale fingers that seemed to reach for their very souls. In one last desperate act, Emily grabbed Jason's hand and pulled him toward the nearest window. She didn't care that it was locked, or that the glass was too thick to break with her bare hands. She needed to get out. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice full of terror, as the figure closed in on them. But before they could break the window, the house responded. A violent tremor shook the floor, sending them both sprawling to the ground. The walls groaned, the air crackled with energy, and in that moment, they realized the house wasn't just alive, it was angry. With a deafening roar, the floor beneath them gave way. Emily screamed as she fell into the darkness below, her hands desperately grasping for anything to hold on to. Jason reached for her, but it was too late. She was gone. The shadows overtook him then, pulling him into the same abyss. For a long, breathless moment, there was only darkness, only the sound of the house's pulse and the whispers of the figure, growing fainter and fainter. When Jason awoke, he was alone. The house was silent again. The walls were still, the oppressive energy gone, replaced by an eerie calm. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as if weighed down by the weight of centuries. He struggled to his feet and looked around. The house had returned to normal, at least on the surface. The mirrors no longer flickered, the shadows no longer seemed to watch him. But something had changed. He knew it. He could feel it. The door to the hidden room was gone. The house, the entity, had sealed it once more, perhaps forever. But as Jason made his way toward the front door, he caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. A figure, dark and shifting, standing in the shadows of the living room. And for the first time since he and Emily had moved in, Jason realized the truth. The mansion hadn't been haunting them. It had been waiting for someone to open the door. And now it had claimed them, forever. Jason froze, his hand hovering just inches from the door handle. He had heard the whispers again, soft and distant, but now they were clearer, almost beckoning him. The figure in the reflection moved slightly, its form more solid than before, as though it were finally making its way out of the mirror, pushing through the glass like a liquid shadow. His heart hammered in his chest, but his feet felt rooted to the floor, as though something was holding him in place, preventing him from leaving. The house, it wasn't done with him. It had already claimed Emily. Now it was ready to claim him. He turned slowly, unwillingly, his eyes locked on the figure in the reflection. Its eyes glowing faintly, like embers in the dark, met his, and the space between them seemed to shrink. The whispers, now louder, swirled in his mind, twisting his thoughts, urging him to step closer, to embrace the darkness. But he resisted. With every ounce of willpower he had left, he turned back to the door. He had to escape. The house had taken too much already, he couldn't let it take him too. Just as his fingers brushed against the handle, the entire mansion seemed to groan. A deep, guttural sound, like the earth itself was coming alive. The walls began to shift again, closing in around him, and Jason heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway behind him. He spun around, expecting to see the figure, but found nothing. The hallway was empty, yet the footsteps grew louder, closer. It was then that he realized the house wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that had been luring people in for decades, feeding off their fear, their souls, their very existence. He could feel its hunger, gnawing at the edges of his mind, urging him to stay, to surrender. But he refused. His life was not meant to be a part of this place, this prison. With one final, desperate motion, Jason threw open the door and bolted outside. He ran, not stopping, not looking back, as if the very ground beneath him were alive, urging him to keep moving, keep escaping. As he reached the end of the driveway, he dared a glance over his shoulder, half expecting the mansion to be gone, swallowed by the night. But there it stood, its dark silhouette looming in the distance. The lights in the windows flickered, and for a brief moment, Jason could have sworn he saw a figure standing in one of them. It was Emily, or something that looked like her. A chill ran down his spine as he turned and ran faster, not daring to slow down until the mansion was a distant memory, a nightmare buried behind him. But even as he disappeared into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching him, and that no matter how far he ran, it would never truly let him go. In the depths of the dark mansion, the shadows moved once more. The house waited, its pulse steady, ready for the next soul to step through its doors. And so the cycle would continue, forever. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.